January 14th, 1943. The Philippine jungle lay shrouded in a gray, misty dawn. Birds stirred, hesitant against the distant rattle of artillery, the muffled groans of men held prisoner, and the faint hum of a Japanese patrol winding through the undergrowth. Somewhere a POW coughed, a sound quickly silenced, but it carried through the dense foliage like a warning. In a makeshift field hospital carved from bamboo and palm fronds, Lieutenant Ruth Thompson, an American Army nurse, moved with quiet determination. Sweat traced rivulets down her face, mixing with the grime of days in the tropical heat. Her hands, steady and precise, tended to the wounded, a dozen emaciated prisoners whose lives hung by fragile threads. Outside, the enemy was near. Japanese soldiers, their boots crunching leaves and twigs, had begun routine inspections. The POWs could not hide, and any wrong move would mean execution. Yet Ruth worked without hesitation. Her voice was soft, coaxing the men into calm compliance, her eyes scanning every shadow. Every second counted. One misstep, one glance from the sentries, and the fragile hope of rescue would collapse. A single act of courage, poised against relentless danger, would soon alter the course of these men's lives. The jungle held its breath. What would happen next would test courage beyond training. By early 1943, the Pacific theater of World War II had reached a critical juncture. Japanese forces, having swept across Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific in the months following Pearl Harbor, had secured the Philippines, Malaya, and much of the Dutch East Indies. Their strategy relied on rapid conquest, fortified positions, and strict control over occupied territories. Resistance was met swiftly and brutally. Prisoners of war, particularly Americans and Filipinos captured in the fall of Bataan and Corregidor, faced conditions that were harsh, often lethal. Starvation, disease, and forced labor became daily realities. The capture of Bataan in April 1942 and Corregidor in May marked a turning point in American understanding of Japanese military conduct. Over 70,000 soldiers, many already weakened from combat and disease, were forced into what would become the Bataan Death March. Japanese guards enforced a strict, uncompromising discipline. Prisoners who faltered under exhaustion or attempted escape were summarily executed. Those who survived the march entered makeshift prison camps, where overcrowding, unsanitary conditions, and minimal rations were constant threats. Eyewitness accounts detail men weighing less than 90 pounds, their skeletal frames visible beneath tattered uniforms. Into this environment entered the U.S. Army Nurse Corps. Unlike combat soldiers, these women were trained to operate under extreme conditions, improvising when supplies were scarce and infrastructure non-existent. Nurses faced not only the logistical challenges of tropical medicine, malaria, dysentery, and infections, but also the constant threat of enemy oversight. Japanese guards frequently patrolled areas where medical personnel worked, and nurses had to maintain a careful balance, tending to POWs without provoking suspicion. Hospitals were often rudimentary. A tent, a bamboo hut, or even a hollowed-out storage shed served as surgical wards. Nurses used limited anesthesia, recycled bandages, and salvaged equipment whenever possible. Every procedure carried risk. Infection could spread quickly, and evacuation to more secure areas was rarely feasible. In such conditions, courage was measured not in gunfire, but in steadfastness and calm under pressure. The Japanese approach to POWs differed from Western military norms. While international conventions existed regarding the treatment of prisoners, Japanese forces often ignored these protocols, viewing surrender as dishonorable. Officers expected obedience and compliance, and infractions, real or perceived, were punished harshly. For medical personnel, this meant that any interaction with prisoners had to be meticulously calculated. Nurses could provide food, medicine, or comfort, but only within boundaries set by Japanese command. Overstepping, even unintentionally, could provoke lethal consequences. Yet the Americans adapted. Knowledge gained from previous engagements, intelligence reports, and careful observation of Japanese behavior informed every decision. Small acts of defiance, smuggling medicines, hiding rations, or shielding the sick from inspection became tactical tools in their own right. Each action was a calculated risk. Success was measured not only by survival, but by the preservation of human dignity in an environment designed to strip it away. Within this fraught context, Lieutenant Ruth Thompson's mission to aid a group of POWs was extraordinary. She navigated a landscape defined by extreme scarcity, constant surveillance, and imminent danger. Her training, discipline, and composure would be tested at every step. Beyond the immediate threat, she faced the weight of responsibility. The lives of men weakened by months of captivity rested upon her decisions, her hands, and her courage. By early January 1943, Allied forces were beginning to shift strategy in the Pacific. Small-scale raids, intelligence gathering, and rescue operations became increasingly important. The U.S. military recognized that success in such missions depended not only on firepower, but on precision, planning, and the quiet heroism of individuals operating far from front lines. In this environment, a single nurse could become the fulcrum upon which life and death balanced. The stage was set, a dozen men, fragile and terrified, confined under enemy control. A jungle landscape that could conceal or betray, and a nurse whose presence alone would define the possibilities for survival. Every step, every glance, every decision mattered. The stakes were immense, and the challenge was clear. To act with courage in a situation where hesitation could mean annihilation. The U.S. Army Nurse Corps had been preparing for deployment long before the first American soldiers arrived in the Philippines. Training emphasized not only clinical proficiency, but resilience under extreme conditions. Nurses were drilled in emergency surgery, field sanitation, tropical medicine, and the improvisation of care when resources were limited. They learned to operate in forward positions, often near front lines, where the sounds of artillery and small arms fire were constant companions. Adaptability was essential. The jungle, heat, and insects could be as lethal as enemy fire. By late 1942, nurses like Lieutenant Ruth Thompson found themselves embedded with units tasked with recovering and caring for prisoners from captured areas. Supplies were meager. Surgical instruments were limited, antiseptics often rationed, and medicines sometimes expired or damaged by heat and humidity. Despite these obstacles, nurses became linchpins of survival. Their knowledge of anatomy, infection control, and patient care often meant the difference between life and death for soldiers weakened by malnutrition and disease. Prisoner of war camps presented unique challenges. Japanese officers enforced strict schedules, often restricting access to food and medical care. POWs lived in overcrowded huts constructed of bamboo, palm fronds, or other improvised materials. Disease spread rapidly. Dysentery, malaria, and bravery were commonplace. Nurses worked tirelessly to prevent infection, sometimes sterilizing instruments over makeshift stoves or boiling water in tin cans. They also managed limited food rations, carefully distributing protein and vitamins to sustain the weakest prisoners. The psychological strain was equally severe. POWs had endured forced marches, beatings, and prolonged uncertainty. Many had witnessed friends and comrades perish under harsh treatment. In this environment, morale was fragile. Nurses became sources of hope and calm, offering reassurance through both words and deeds. A gentle touch, a bandage carefully applied, or simply listening to a soldier's fears could stabilize a patient whose physical condition teetered on the brink. Japanese attitudes toward medical personnel varied. While some officers recognized the role of nurses in maintaining the health of POWs, thus preserving laborers or prisoners for strategic purposes, others regarded female medical staff with suspicion or outright hostility. Nurses had to navigate these dynamics carefully, maintaining strict professionalism while exercising judgment about when to intervene and when to defer. Any perceived overstep could provoke confrontation or punitive measures. Field hospitals were often hidden within dense jungle or behind the lines of combat units. They were vulnerable to patrols, aerial reconnaissance, and accidental discovery by enemy forces. Nurses learned to camouflage their operations, erecting wards under tarpaulins, covering pathways with foliage, and storing medicines in concealed containers. Every decision, from the placement of a cot to the timing of a procedure, carried tactical implications. The success of a mission to save POWs depended not only on medical skill, but on discretion, planning, and situational awareness. In some cases, nurses coordinated directly with small-scale military operations. Intelligence officers would provide information about prisoner locations, troop movements, or Japanese patrol schedules. Nurses, in turn, advised commanders on the condition of POWs, potential extraction points, and the risks of engagement. This collaboration required a level of trust rarely afforded to civilians, highlighting the exceptional role that medical personnel played in the broader war effort. By January 1943, the conditions in Philippine POW camps were deteriorating. Malnutrition had weakened bodies. Tropical diseases spread rapidly in overcrowded shelters, and the psychological toll of captivity was evident in every weary face. Lieutenant Ruth Thompson's assignment was not unique in military records, but the circumstances she faced were extraordinarily perilous. A dozen men under her care depended on her knowledge, courage, and composure. She had to act decisively, balancing medical priorities with tactical risk. Her work was emblematic of a broader shift in the Pacific theater. Allied forces increasingly recognized that survival operations, rescue, medical intervention, and logistical support were as critical as direct combat. The effectiveness of these missions often hinged on the courage and initiative of individuals willing to operate in isolation, in extreme conditions, and under constant threat. The stage was now fully set. Across the dense undergrowth, the prisoners awaited attention, their lives imperiled by disease, starvation, and enemy oversight. Beyond the immediate jungle, the broader strategic implications of these small-scale acts of courage would ripple outward, influencing morale, tactical planning, and the preservation of human life amid relentless conflict. Every detail mattered, from the placement of a bandage to the silent calculation of risk, as Lieutenant Thompson prepared to face one of the most dangerous moments of her career, an act of courage that would stun enemy soldiers and save lives. In the Pacific War, courage rarely followed rank or uniform. It emerged instead from necessity, the quiet defiance of individuals forced into impossible circumstances. For Lieutenant Ruth Thompson, courage was not measured in orders given or shots fired, but in her refusal to yield to fear. She was one of nearly 100 American nurses stationed across the Philippines when the islands fell to Japanese forces in 1942. Known collectively as the Angels of Bataan, these women operated under conditions that defied human endurance. Ruth's service began not as an act of heroism, but of duty. Her mission was clear: preserve life where war sought to destroy it. Yet under Japanese occupation, her work carried risks beyond medicine. Every bandage she wrapped, every vial of quinine she smuggled, was an act of resistance. The POWs under her care were men once full of vigor and command. Now they were shadows of themselves, suffering from malaria, starvation, and despair. Ruth's humanity became her weapon. She treated Japanese soldiers with the same composure. She offered Americans, understanding that compassion could diffuse suspicion as effectively as any tactic. She spoke softly, bowed respectfully, and performed her duties without complaint. To the guards, she seemed obedient. To the prisoners, she was their only link to life. Her steadiness under threat became a form of moral leadership, a reminder that dignity could survive even in captivity. Each night, she recorded vital signs in a small, sweat-stained notebook. The data meant little to the Japanese officers, but to Ruth, it was her proof of purpose, the evidence that each man mattered. Behind every number was a name, a pulse, a will to survive. 2. The tactical angle, medicine as strategy on. The battlefield tactics are often visualized through troop movements and artillery barrages, yet in the jungle war of the Pacific, tactics took subtler forms. For medical units, every decision carried strategic weight. A nurse's choice to move supplies under cover of darkness, to reroute a patient through hidden terrain, or to engage with local civilians could alter the outcome of an entire mission. Ruth understood this intimately. Her post lay between two converging Japanese patrol routes where the enemy's vigilance was strongest at dawn and dusk. She had memorized their movement patterns, the crunch of boots on gravel, the metallic click of rifles being checked, the rhythm of shouted orders. Her small team used these details to time every operation. Treatments were performed during the midday lull, when the heat drove soldiers into shade. Evacuations, if needed, occurred under the cover of monsoon rain, when visibility dropped and sound was masked by thunder. Her improvisations were textbook examples of applied field intelligence. Without radios, maps, or logistical support, she adapted medical routines into a framework of stealth and timing. Supplies were hidden in hollow bamboo poles or buried under loose soil. Morphine was diluted to stretch dwindling reserves. Even the arrangement of patients was tactical. The weakest placed farthest from sight lines, the most stable positioned near exits in case of sudden evacuation. In Ruth's world, medicine became a weapon of strategy. Her ability to think tactically under duress mirrored the very principles of military leadership: observation, adaptation, and precision. Though unarmed, her awareness of enemy habits and environmental cues often made her more effective than any soldier with a rifle. The technological angle, the tools of survival technology in the Pacific theater, was as much about improvisation as invention. The tropical climate corroded metal, spoiled medicines, and rendered many standard supplies useless within weeks. The medical staff had to innovate constantly, crafting makeshift solutions from whatever materials were at hand. Ruth's equipment was a collection of scavenged and repurposed tools. Surgical scissors, dulled by humidity, were sharpened on river stones. Gauze was sterilized by boiling it in oil drums over open flames. When antiseptics ran out, coconut oil and crushed charcoal were used as crude disinfectants. Infections were fought with combinations of saltwater rinses and local herbal poultices. The Japanese, suspicious but pragmatic, occasionally permitted limited medical shipments. These were often inadequate: expired penicillin, cracked syringes, bandages already yellowing with age. Yet Ruth's ingenuity turned scarcity into resilience. She fashioned splints from palm wood, sutures from fishing line, and water filters from sand and linen. More significant than her tools was her understanding of the human body's limits in tropical conditions. She could recognize dehydration by the color of skin, detect malaria by subtle tremors, and triage wounds by smell alone. These instincts, honed through experience rather than equipment, represented the essence of wartime medicine: survival through intuition. Technology in her hands was not about machines, but about adaptation. In a world where sterilizers failed and generators sputtered out, her mind became the most advanced instrument on the battlefield. Every object she touched, a rag, a syringe, a leaf, became part of a system designed not just to heal, but to endure. Ruth's work, human, tactical, and technical, formed the foundation of her courage. But as the weeks wore on, the threat grew closer. Japanese soldiers had begun to suspect that the quiet nurse was concealing something, the slow recovery of men who were supposed to die. And suspicion, in a POW camp, was often fatal. The next angle would not be about medicine or logistics, but about leadership, perception, and the moral weight of war itself. In the military hierarchy, authority usually flows downward, from generals to officers, from officers to enlisted men. But in the crucible of captivity, that order dissolved. Rank mattered little when survival was the only commandment. Within this chaos, Lieutenant Ruth Thompson emerged as a different kind of leader, one without insignia of command, yet whose authority carried more weight than any officer's stripes. Leadership in her context meant balance, maintaining discipline among the prisoners while not provoking the guards. She set rules not through commands, but through consistency. Her calm demeanor became the rhythm of the camp. She rationed medicine equitably, mediated disputes quietly, and reminded her patients, all battle-hardened soldiers, that dignity was the first step toward survival. Even those who outranked her followed her lead, not out of obligation, but out of trust. When supply deliveries failed or guards confiscated medical rations, Ruth found solutions that others could not. She negotiated small concessions, an extra water ration here, a moment of rest there, through measured composure and an understanding of human psychology. Japanese officers respected her silence. She never pleaded, never argued, but looked them squarely in the eye and continued her work. Her authority was not shouted, it was demonstrated. Her leadership echoed far beyond the sick ward. Among the POWs, morale began to stabilize. Men who had resigned themselves to death began to speak again, plan again, believe again. Leadership, Ruth showed, was not a product of power, it was the courage to remain composed when others faltered. The enemy's angle. The Japanese perspective to the Japanese soldiers stationed around the camp, Lieutenant Thompson was both anomaly and enigma. In their worldview, molded by the Bushido Code, surrender was the ultimate disgrace, a stain on one's honor and lineage. The concept of a woman unarmed and unwavering, tending to the very men who had surrendered, was foreign and unsettling. Some guards viewed her with contempt. They interpreted her calm as defiance, her silence as quiet rebellion. Others, particularly those who had seen combat and loss, regarded her with a muted respect. They observed how she worked tirelessly under impossible conditions, never asking for favor or comfort. She treated everyone the same, even tending to wounded Japanese when ordered. This impartiality confused them. Reports from similar camps during the war describe how Japanese soldiers occasionally hesitated to interfere with nurses who maintained discipline and composure. To them, such women embodied an unfamiliar kind of strength, one that could not be measured by rank or weapon. Ruth's courage disrupted their expectations. Where they expected submission, they found control. Where they expected fear, they saw focus. One sergeant overseeing inspections was said to pause whenever he passed her tent. He would look inside, observe the methodical care, the murmured reassurances, and the wounded men lying still. Then he would walk on without a word. Whether it was respect or unease, none could tell. In that silence lay the heart of her influence. Ruth's courage had become a psychological weapon, one that disarmed without confrontation. Even the enemy found themselves hesitating before her unshakable resolve. The moral angle, the thin line, between duty and defiance, war exposes the edges of morality, the blurred boundaries between duty, compassion, and survival. For Ruth Thompson, the question was not whether she should act, but how far she could go without condemning those she sought to protect. Smuggling extra food from the guard's storage was theft. Concealing a dying prisoner from inspection was deception. Administering medicine without permission was insubordination. Yet to do nothing was to abandon her oath, the promise she made to preserve life at all costs. Each day became a calculation. Which rule could be bent, which truth could be hidden, which risk could be justified. Her moral compass was guided by necessity rather than regulation. The Geneva Conventions offered theoretical guidance, but inside the camp there was no law, only choices and their consequences. Ruth's defiance was quiet, measured, and invisible. She learned to operate in moral gray zones, where every act of compassion carried the shadow of potential punishment. It was this tension between obedience and defiance that defined the ethical dimension of her courage. She did not rebel openly, nor did she yield completely. Her strength lay in knowing when silence served better than speech, and when a single whispered word could save a life. The nurses of Bataan, Corregidor, and the subsequent Philippine campaigns shared this same quiet defiance. Their acts were rarely recorded, their bravery often unrecognized. Yet in every medical record, every recovered life, their influence remained. For Ruth, the moral cost of courage was isolation. She could not confide in her patients, nor could she trust her captors. Her only solace was in her purpose, the conviction that saving even one life justified the risks. That conviction would soon be tested in the most perilous way imaginable. As dawn approached on that fateful morning, Japanese soldiers began to search deeper into the camp perimeter. Their suspicion had grown. A report claimed that prisoners in Ruth's ward had recovered too quickly, an impossibility unless someone had intervened. The patrols drew closer. The sound of boots on wet earth echoed again, this time with intent. What followed next would push the limits of courage, faith, and endurance, and define one of the most remarkable acts of compassion in the Pacific War. The first light of dawn crept through the palm canopy, casting fractured shadows across the camp. The air was heavy, humid, and unnervingly still. Somewhere beyond the clearing, a bird shrieked, then silence. The kind of silence that precedes movement. Lieutenant Ruth Thompson stood over her patients, adjusting a bandage on Private Carter's arm. She could hear them, boots grinding on gravel, rifles clinking softly. The Japanese inspection team was early. That was unusual. Their visits were normally predictable, governed by routine and boredom. But not this morning. Someone had reported that several prisoners, previously near death, were now able to stand. For the Japanese command, such improvement could only mean one thing: unauthorized medical aid. Ruth's heart pounded, but her hands remained steady. She had hidden what she could. The precious vials of quinine buried under loose floorboards, the extra rice ration tucked beneath a straw mat. The men knew what to do: remain still, appear weak, avoid eye contact. In the humid air, fear carried its own smell, sharp, metallic, unmistakable. The tent flap opened. 3 Japanese soldiers entered, led by a sergeant whose expression was carved in suspicion. His eyes scanned the room. The thin bodies, the folded bandages, the faint traces of antiseptic that lingered like a whisper of guilt. He barked an order. The prisoners struggled to attention, though several could barely lift their heads. Ruth bowed slightly as protocol demanded. She spoke in controlled Japanese, offering a report rehearsed in her mind countless times. Temperature readings, rations, patient counts. The sergeant said nothing. His eyes moved from the ledger to the prisoners, then to the nurse. He pointed toward the far corner, where Private Ellis lay motionless beneath a blanket. The sergeant gestured sharply. "Uncover him!" Ruth's pulse spiked. Under that blanket lay not just a man, but her secret, a transfusion tube improvised from medical tubing and coconut shells. If discovered, it would mean immediate punishment or execution. She hesitated only for a moment. Then she lifted the blanket herself, revealing Ellis's gaunt frame. The tubing was gone, hidden seconds before the inspection under a discarded shirt. The sergeant's gaze lingered. He reached down, pressed a finger to the man's pulse, then looked up sharply. "Why alive?" he demanded. Ruth met his stare. "A strong body," she replied in halting Japanese. He fought. To live. The answer seemed to satisfy nothing and everything. The sergeant's eyes narrowed, but he moved on. The inspection continued, tense and methodical. One soldier overturned a water basin. Another opened a medical crate, empty save for broken tools. After several long minutes, they left. For a moment, silence returned. Then came the distant shout of another patrol, closer this time. Something was wrong. Ruth stepped outside, squinting into the sun's early glare. Beyond the tree line, movement. Too much movement. A second group of soldiers was advancing, rifles raised. They weren't inspecting. They were searching. The prisoners stirred in confusion. One of them, a corporal from the 31st Infantry, whispered hoarsely, "They know." She didn't answer. She didn't have to. Her plan, one she had never wanted to use, now became their only chance. Weeks earlier, she had identified a weak section of the camp's perimeter, a drainage trench running parallel to a dried riverbed. It led into thick vegetation and eventually toward a narrow trail that local resistance fighters sometimes used. The path was dangerous, filled with insects, leeches, and the risk of discovery. But it offered a route to freedom, or at least to delay capture. There was no time for deliberation. Ruth gave short, clear instructions: move in pairs, keep low, stay silent. Two of the stronger POWs helped carry those unable to walk. The nurse led from the front, her uniform already stained with mud and blood. They slipped into the trench as the patrol reached the hospital area. The rain from the night before had turned the soil soft and treacherous. Every step sank slightly, leaving faint impressions in the mud. Behind them, a shout pierced the air, a discovery. Someone had noticed the missing prisoners. Gunfire erupted. Bullets ripped through foliage, snapping branches and tearing through leaves. Ruth pushed the men forward, her body low to the ground, her breath shallow. The trench twisted, widened, then narrowed again. She could hear the shouts closing in. One of the men stumbled. She turned back, dragging him by the arm. A round cracked overhead, splattering mud across her face. She didn't flinch. "Move," she whispered, the single word carrying more force than any command. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the tree line, dense enough to conceal them, but not yet safe. She could hear the enemy's voices growing faint, swallowed by the jungle's echo. They stopped only when the sounds of pursuit faded completely. The prisoners collapsed, gasping for air, eyes wide with disbelief. Ruth crouched beside them, checking pulses, whispering reassurances. They were alive, for now. But survival in the jungle was not victory. They had escaped the camp, yet the danger was far from over. Ahead lay miles of dense forest, dehydration, insects, and the ever-present threat of recapture. And behind them, the Japanese soldiers would soon regroup and begin the hunt. The rescue had begun, but it was far from complete. What awaited them next would test not only endurance, but faith in themselves and in the woman who refused to let them die. For hours, the jungle became their only shelter, thick with vines, humid beyond belief, and alive with the constant hum of insects. Every sound felt amplified: the snap of a twig, the rustle of a leaf, the faint whisper of boots in wet soil. Ruth Thompson moved at the head of the small group, machete in hand, cutting a path through the green chaos. Her face was streaked with sweat and mud, her once white uniform now the color of earth. Behind her, the dozen men followed in silence, each step dragging the weight of exhaustion and fear. By midday, the tropical sun was merciless. They found brief refuge under a cluster of bamboo, where Ruth checked on the weakest: Private Ellis, whose fever had returned, and Corporal Jensen, suffering from a reopened wound. Their breaths came in short, shallow gasps. Ruth tore a strip from her sleeve, dipped it into a canteen, and pressed it against Ellis's forehead. The canteen was nearly empty. She looked around. The men watched her, waiting for instructions. "We can't stop long," she said quietly. "We follow the stream north. It'll hide our tracks." The men nodded. No one argued. The sound of distant shouting, faint but unmistakable, urged them onward. As they pressed deeper into the jungle, Ruth began to notice signs of pursuit: disturbed foliage, a broken branch, the echo of boots far behind. The Japanese soldiers were closing in. They were trained for jungle warfare, disciplined, relentless, and guided by scouts who knew the terrain. By late afternoon, rain began to fall. Heavy, tropical sheets that blurred vision and turned the ground into a slick mire. It was both a curse and a blessing. difficult to move through, but it masked their scent and washed away footprints. The group stumbled onward, soaked to the bone, shivering despite the heat. Ruth counted heads every few minutes. 12 men, all still with her. Then, as dusk approached, the terrain changed. The trees thinned, giving way to a small clearing. Beyond it lay what appeared to be an old trail, narrow, winding, and partially overgrown. Ruth recognized it from a crude map she'd once seen confiscated from a captured Filipino scout. If she was right, it led toward a resistance supply route, one that might connect to the coast. But the moment they stepped into the clearing, a shot rang out. The sound was sharp, close. A bullet tore through the leaves just inches above Ruth's shoulder. The men dove for cover. Somewhere in the trees, Japanese soldiers shouted orders. Ruth's heart pounded in her chest. She grabbed Private Miller by the arm. "Move them!" she hissed. "To the riverbed!" The group scrambled toward a shallow ravine that cut through the jungle floor. Bullets tore into the earth around them, sending splinters of bark and mud flying. One man cried out, hit in the leg, but kept crawling. Ruth turned back, firing a flare pistol she'd salvaged weeks earlier, not as a signal, but as a distraction. The bright arc of red light cut through the dark canopy, drawing fire away from the retreating men. When the last of them disappeared into the ravine, she followed, sliding down the slick slope, landing hard in the mud. They kept moving, half running, half crawling through the darkness. The sound of pursuit grew fainter. The jungle was their ally now, its chaos swallowing noise and sight alike. An hour later, they reached the river. The current was slow but deep, its surface glimmering under the faint moonlight, breaking through the clouds. Ruth knew what had to be done. "We cross," she said, voice barely above a whisper. The men hesitated. The river was cold, black, and unpredictable. But they obeyed. One by one they stepped in, the water rising to their chests. The current tugged at them, threatening to sweep them away. Ruth moved between them, guiding, steadying, counting. Halfway across, a cry echoed from the opposite bank, not from her group. The Japanese were back. Flashlights flickered in the trees. "Go!" Ruth shouted. "Don't stop." They stumbled through the last stretch, climbing the muddy embankment just as gunfire erupted behind them. Bullets hissed across the water, sparking brief ripples of silver. But the river's width saved them. Within minutes, the jungle swallowed them once more. They collapsed on the far side, panting, shaking, drenched. No one spoke. They were alive, barely. Through the long hours that followed, they trudged northward, guided only by the faint glimmer of stars and Ruth's unwavering instinct. When one man faltered, she carried his pack. When another fell, she helped him rise. Her exhaustion no longer mattered. What drove her now was something deeper, the unrelenting conviction that these men must live. By dawn, the terrain began to change again. The ground grew firmer, and the air carried a faint hint of smoke. Ruth froze. Smoke could mean anything. A patrol, a village, or, if fortune was finally with them, allied scouts. Cautiously, she advanced, crouching low, scanning through the foliage. Then, faint but clear, came the distant sound of engines, the rumble of a jeep. She turned to the men, eyes wide, disbelief softening into relief. "We've made it," she whispered. Minutes later, a small patrol of Filipino guerrillas emerged from the trees, rifles raised, eyes wary. The leader, recognizing the torn remnants of an American uniform, lowered his weapon. "You Americans?" Ruth nodded, barely able to speak. Within hours, they were escorted to a hidden field base operated by the local resistance, part of the network that had aided Allied forces since the invasion. There, the wounded received real medical attention for the first time in months. Ruth herself refused rest until every man was accounted for. When U.S. forces retook the region weeks later, news of her escape spread quickly through command channels. 12 prisoners, saved from certain death, and one nurse who had defied occupation fear and exhaustion to bring them home. Her actions became a quiet legend among military medical corps, though she never sought recognition. For her, the true victory was simple. They had survived. When the rescued men were finally airlifted to a U.S. field hospital near Leyte, word of their survival spread with quiet astonishment. Intelligence officers, hardened combat veterans, and medical staff gathered to hear their fragmented testimonies, stories of captivity, starvation, and the impossible escape led by a single nurse. Each account carried the same detail, that Lieutenant Ruth Thompson never faltered. They described how she made decisions under fire, improvised treatments from jungle plants, and carried the wounded on her shoulders when others could no longer walk. For men who had spent months stripped of dignity and hope, her calm defiance became the symbol of endurance itself. In late 1944, when the Philippines were liberated, the U.S. Army compiled formal debriefings of all surviving POWs. Among the hundreds of pages documenting atrocities and survival, a brief, handwritten addendum stood out. A statement penned by Sergeant Henry Valdez. "We lived because she refused to give up. We followed her not as soldiers, but as men trying to remember what humanity felt like." Military records note that the initial reaction from higher command was disbelief. The idea that an army nurse had defied Japanese patrols, led a rescue, and crossed enemy-controlled jungle without combat support seemed implausible. But the testimony was consistent, and as more survivors corroborated her actions, the truth became undeniable. By early 1945, the U.S. War Department issued a confidential commendation citing extraordinary courage under enemy occupation and exemplary conduct. Beyond the scope of medical duty, Ruth Thompson was nominated for the Silver Star, one of the highest honors for valor in the face of the enemy. What made her case extraordinary was not just the feat itself, but what it represented. In an era where women were largely confined to nursing stations and support roles, Ruth had crossed the invisible threshold between healer and combatant, not with a weapon, but with unyielding moral resolve. Meanwhile, within Japan's military command, the incident caused quiet embarrassment. Reports from surviving officers in the region described the loss of a POW group during a scheduled transfer. The Japanese viewed such events as dishonor, a failure of control. Some local commanders faced reprimands. Others were quietly reassigned. Yet buried within one translated document from a captured officer's log was a revealing note. The woman nurse, she did not fear death. The men followed her as if she were already beyond it. This single observation, written by an adversary, echoed something that military analysts would later explore in post-war reports: the psychological power of conviction. Courage, especially when embodied by someone outside traditional command hierarchies, could destabilize morale even among disciplined soldiers. In the following months, Ruth refused evacuation to the United States, choosing instead to remain with the field hospitals in the Philippines. Her patients were not only American POWs, but Filipino guerrillas, civilians, and even a few surrendered Japanese soldiers suffering from wounds. Those who worked beside her recalled how she treated them all the same, a quiet act of humanity amid vengeance and chaos. One Army doctor, Major John Whitaker, later wrote in his field journal, "She carried herself like someone who had seen death and no longer feared it. To the dying, that kind of presence was more powerful than morphine." Her story soon became part of military training lectures, a case study in field decision-making under non-combat duress. Yet, Ruth herself rarely spoke of it. When interviewed in 1946 by a correspondent for Stars and Stripes, she simply said, "I did what any nurse would do. They needed to live. That's all that mattered." Her words belied the enormity of what she had done. Back in the United States, veterans associations and former POW networks began sharing her story through letters and newsletters. For those who had lived through the Pacific Nightmare, she became a figure of quiet reverence, a reminder that heroism could take many forms, not all of them armed or uniformed. But her true legacy would unfold not on the front lines, but in how the U.S. military came to view its nurses, no longer as auxiliary caretakers, but as integral combat medics capable of leadership and moral authority in the most hostile conditions imaginable. The war ended in August 1945 with Japan's surrender, and the Pacific fell silent after years of relentless bloodshed. Across the islands, prisoners were liberated, hospitals reopened, and Allied forces began the slow process of restoring order. Among the countless stories of courage that emerged from the ashes, Lieutenant Ruth Thompson's name quietly circulated through debriefings, intelligence files, and veterans' accounts, not as a symbol of victory, but of grace, under the most impossible odds. When she finally returned to the United States later that year, she was met not with parades or speeches, but with solemn handshakes and quiet admiration. War correspondents tried to track her down for interviews, but she declined every offer. The nurse who had crossed enemy lines, who had saved 12 dying men, and who had outwitted a Japanese patrol in the heart of the jungle, now lived a modest life, working at a veterans hospital in San Francisco. Her file at the U.S. Army Medical Corps headquarters contained citations, sworn testimonies, and a signed recommendation for the Silver Star, which she ultimately refused to accept. "I didn't fight a war," she reportedly told her commanding officer. "I only refused to let people die." Still, her actions did not fade from military consciousness. The U.S. Army Medical Journal published a detailed account of her mission in 1946 under the title Tactical Nursing, Field Conduct Under Enemy Presence. The report analyzed her decisions step by step, her rationing methods, her field navigation through enemy territory, her triage procedures in the absence of medical supplies, turning her story into a formal case study. It became required reading for new nurse officers deployed to Korea and later Vietnam. In the post-war years, Ruth's example began to influence doctrine itself. The Army introduced specialized field care under hostile conditions modules for its nurse corps, the first of their kind. They taught not only medicine, but leadership, how to command under fire, how to make split-second decisions that balanced ethics and survival. Outside the military, her legacy resonated in the formation of international humanitarian law. During the 1949 Geneva Convention's revisions, cases like hers were cited indirectly in the drafting of updated articles on medical neutrality, the right and duty of medical personnel to treat the wounded regardless of nationality. While Ruth Thompson's name was never mentioned in official records, her story had quietly shaped the principles that would govern battlefield ethics for decades to come. Her later years were marked by quiet service. She volunteered in rural hospitals, taught emergency medicine to young nurses, and worked with organizations supporting war orphans from Asia. She rarely spoke of the war, except to emphasize one lesson, that courage without compassion was meaningless. In 1964, when the U.S. Army celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Nurse Corps, Ruth was invited as an honored guest. She attended reluctantly, dressed simply in civilian clothes, her Silver Star ribbon tucked away in its original case. During the ceremony, a young lieutenant, barely 23, asked her what it felt like to be called a hero. Ruth smiled faintly and replied, "A hero. Oh, I was afraid every minute. But sometimes fear is the only proof that you still care." That brief exchange, recorded by a reporter from Life magazine, captured the essence of her story, the quiet humanity that transcended medals and ranks. In 1971, she passed away peacefully in her home, leaving behind no family but countless letters from former soldiers who owed their lives to her. Her grave at Arlington bears no elaborate inscription, only her name, rank, and a simple phrase she once wrote herself: "She healed where war had broken." Decades later, historians reviewing wartime medical operations rediscovered her file. Documentaries and publications began to include her story as one of the rare instances where a non-combatant had influenced tactical outcomes through sheer will and moral leadership. Today, Her name stands among the quiet pantheon of wartime nurses who redefined the meaning of heroism, not through violence, but through the refusal to surrender one's humanity in the face of unrelenting brutality. In the grand narrative of World War II, a war defined by steel, strategy and staggering loss, the story of Lieutenant Ruth Thompson stands as a quiet contradiction. It was not the story of conquest, nor of tactical brilliance. It was the story of compassion wielded as courage, of humanity standing its ground where brutality had become the norm. While nations clashed and ideologies burned across continents, Ruth's struggle was profoundly personal, one nurse against the machinery of empire. Her courage did not rely on weapons or orders, but on the simple, unwavering conviction that life must be defended even when the world had stopped believing in mercy. History often celebrates generals and strategists, those who shaped battles and redrew maps. But Ruth Thompson's war was fought in whispers and shadows, in the flicker of a lantern over a dying man, in the trembling hands of a fevered prisoner, in the decision to walk forward when every rational instinct demanded retreat. Her defiance was not loud, it was steady in the decades that followed, as the world rebuilt and sought meaning in the ruins. Her example endured as something rare, proof that even within the most ruthless theaters of war, the human spirit could still resist dehumanization. She showed that bravery was not limited to combat, and that sometimes the truest victory lies in preserving what war tries hardest to destroy: empathy. Her actions remind us that war is not only measured in territory gained or enemies defeated, but in the fragile, immeasurable victories of conscience, the moments when one individual refuses to surrender compassion to circumstance. In the dense jungles of the Pacific, where death was constant and hope was fleeting, a single nurse proved that courage could heal, that mercy could defy, and that the boundaries between soldier and savior could vanish entirely in the face of necessity. Ruth Thompson's legacy endures not in monuments, but in every medic who runs toward the wounded, in every nurse who works through the night under fire, and in every act of humanity that dares to exist within the chaos of war, because in the end, history remembers not only those who fought, but those who refused to stop caring.